My name is Vincent Slot. Today we will be talking about responsible AI. And if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat so we can discuss them afterwards. This webinar is brought to you by Textkernel, by Bullhorn, and Mishcon Rea. And we want to dive into the topic of responsible AI because we think this is a very important topic and a topic that people might have questions about, and also how this relates to the AI Act and what, well, practical implications this has for your agency or your business. All right, so let's start by introducing ourselves a bit. My name is Vincent. I work as a team lead in the R&D team, Textkernel, which basically means that we build the AI applications, the search and match applications in the Textkernel ecosystem. And with me today is Daniel.
Yeah, hi, I'm Daniel. I'm an associate employment lawyer at Mishcon Rea. So my day-to-day practice is employment law, but I do a lot of work on the intersection between AI and employment law.
All right, thank you. So Textkernel is a name you might have heard in the HR AI domain. We are a global leader in building AI-powered solutions for this domain. And basically that means you use our AI possibly in your ATS or in your HR systems. And it's a company that's been doing AI already for 23 years out of Amsterdam. This summer, we actually joined forces with Bullhorn. They acquired Textkernel. So together we can enhance the recruiter experience even more. I think Daniel is going to give a quick introduction about Mishcon.
Yes, so Mishcon Rea is a law firm in central West London. The firm has expanded rapidly in recent years, so we now span London, Oxford and Cambridge, which are innovation hubs in the UK, Singapore and Hong Kong. So we do cover all areas of law, innovation, private, corporate, real estate, and can advise clients globally on all of these matters.
Great, thank you. Then let's dive into it. So this is the agenda for today. First, we want to talk about the principles of responsible AI and why we should even care about those. Then we'll dive into legislation, the AI Act. What does that actually mean? What does the AI Act say? But also about the practical implications of the AI Act. So what does it mean for the day-to-day business? But let's start at the beginning. What is responsible AI and why should we care? So responsible AI, or AI in general, is a topic that you may have heard a lot about in the past couple of years. But in order to understand why we need to use AI responsibly, we need to dive a bit into the history of AI. So despite AI being very common nowadays, the history of AI actually goes back to the 40s and 50s. You may have heard about the famous computer scientist Alan Turing, who was one of the first scientists to seriously investigate the question, can machines be intelligent? So there is already a long history there, but the first practical applications of AI started emerging in the 80s and 90s. Now, this was much simpler AI than we have today. So generally, these would just be rule-based systems. If X, then Y. So think of, for example, the spam filter in your email. You could say, okay, if an email contains this word, we'll label it as spam. It's very simple, but very effective. The modern day paradigm in AI is called machine learning. And machine learning is basically where you tell the system to learn from data. So instead of explicitly instructing the system these rules, you're going to show it data and say infer rules from this data. So for example, in the spam filter example we just talked about, you could say, well, here's a bunch of spam emails and here is a bunch of regular emails, and you go figure out what separates these two. That's the principle, the concept of machine learning. Now, through the decades since the 90s, machine learning has been developed further, and the current latest wave of these machine learning models are called LLMs, large language models. And even though you may not even have heard this term, you probably know one, because ChatGPT is the most famous example of this one, and there are a couple of others like Claude or Gemini. But this is basically the evolution that these systems went through over the past decades. And the point I want to make here is that these systems are much more powerful now than they were then. But they are also much more complex and intransparent these days. So it is today, with these current models, it's almost impossible to look inside the model and figure out why it gives a certain output. So in this rule-based system, if it would say this is a spam message, well, you could just trace back through these rules and say, okay, that's why it made this decision. If you ask ChatGPT whether an email is a spam email, you can never understand why it makes that decision. You can never look inside these models because they are just too large and too complex to understand. And even the people who build these systems don't fully understand their behavior anymore. So through this added complexity, through this lack of transparency, it's much more important to think, okay, so what implications does this have for society when we start using it? Now, the second reason why we should care about the responsible use of AI is that AI is everywhere nowadays, right? Many decisions are being made about our lives by AIs already, and sometimes without even knowing it. So for example, when you apply for a mortgage or a loan, an AI could be supporting the decision whether you get that loan or mortgage or not. Or in our case, in the HR domain, when you apply for your dream job, it could be an AI that could help decide whether you get that job or not. So this has major implications on the lives of people and on the well-being of people. So having laws that kind of and principles that kind of protect people from these potential risks is very important. So why do we need responsible AI specifically in HR? In HR, when we talk about the risks of AI, most people might immediately think about discrimination and bias in models. So that is a very important practical point why we need to use AI responsibly. But from that, derived from that, you can say also being responsible with your AI usage builds trust. We want people to trust AI systems and to understand why AIs make certain decisions. And last but not least, we have this little thing called fundamental rights. And among these are, for example, the right to work, the right to privacy, the right to be free from discrimination. And these are all, they're called fundamental rights for a good reason. These are very important things that we should respect. So now we talked a bit about why we need responsible AI. but we haven't really looked yet at what that actually is. And at the core, this is very simple. Responsible AI means AI that was designed to benefit all people involved and society as a whole. So not just the people who built the AI system or the recruiter or the candidate, but all of these actors, all of these stakeholders should benefit from the AI system. Now, how that looks in practice, then we're going to look at a few characteristics that define the trustworthiness of an AI system. And I mentioned before already, fairness is a very important one. Fairness means that people are treated equally and by objective criteria, and there are no biases in the system. But that's not all of it. There's also, for example, transparency, that AI knows how to explain its decision making, that people can understand and therefore trust these decisions better. And the third important principle here is that AI should always be designed to aid the humans and not replace them or automate everything end to end. Because it's very important that a human can still see if an AI is doing the right thing and why it is doing what it's doing. So these are just three highlighted characteristics that kind of define the trustworthiness of an AI system. Now, I would also like to highlight three questions that we can ask to understand how this works in practice, because so far it's a bit abstract, but what does this actually mean? The first question there is, what training data is being used? So in this machine learning paradigm, basically every modern AI system is trained on real world data. That's important to realize. Machine learning means you use data. And we already have regulations on what data we can use to train, right? We know this as the GDPR, which kind of protects EU citizens' data. And it tells also under what restrictions we can use this data. But it doesn't tell us how we can use this data for training AI models. And this how is something that will be covered in the upcoming AI Act. We will get more into that, but it also puts up certain standards for the data that it needs to adhere to in order to be to have a high likelihood of being unbiased and a fair model. So you can think of whether all your demographies are represented in your training data, or whether you have the correct information to base decisions. Secondly, one big question when we talk about responsible AI is, which processes are you going to automate? Because the bigger the process you want to fully put into this black box, the higher the risk is of not understanding what the system is doing. And the higher the risk is that there is in one of these steps bias, or because you do need to use very complex models for these end-to-end tasks. However, if you look at this process step by step, it's much easier to automate and much safer to automate. The risks are lower for these particular subtasks, because the models you can use can be simpler models and more explainable. And in each of these steps, there is a human checking the AI model, right? So it's keeping an eye on whether it's performing well or whether something is going wrong. So that's kind of the second question you could ask when you see a system and think, is this responsible AI or not? And lastly, I want to highlight the question, how does the user keep control? So as I mentioned before, AI should be designed to support humans in their tasks, right? So in our case, recruiters or other HR professionals, they should be helped become more efficient with the use of AI. But so it's very important that the designer of these systems thinks about how to do that. We still want to leverage the great power that comes with these LLMs, right? ChatGPT is AI unlike anything we've seen before. So we still want to have that. So in this slide, you see an example of how we apply that at Textkernel, where we basically allow the user to type any kind of input, kind of like you would do in a Google search, just type anything, and the LLM will understand what that means and translate it into the correct structured information. So this way you can leverage both the power of LLMs, understanding this natural language, and leverage the structured search that we already have. So these are some important aspects when we talk about what does it mean to have a responsible AI system. So just a quick recap of this first section. We talked about why responsible AI is important. We've seen that AI systems are getting both more complex and intransparent, and they are getting more impact. And the combination of those two things makes that we have to be quite careful about how we use AI. Well, what is responsible AI? The one sentence summary is AI that is designed to benefit all stakeholders. So there should be equal gain for all people involved. All right, so now we talked about responsible AI and what makes applications, AI systems responsible. But what may be even what may be equally interesting is how this ends up in the AI Act. The AI Act is legislation that is intended to basically cover all these responsible AI principles in a legal framework. And actually, it's not the only kind of AI legislation that is happening. So across the entire world, governments are realizing that it's becoming more important to regulate this sector. So you can imagine that any kind of industry is being regulated right now. So think of things like aviation or the medical industry. They all have strict rules they need to adhere to. And somehow AI is still left unchecked. So it's very good that governments are starting to realize that this needs regulation. Because otherwise AI can cause serious harm to society. And furthermore, if you don't have this regulation, being responsible with your AI is purely an optional thing, right? If you want, you can do it, but so this is really prone to creating an environment for allowing ethical breaches. We also need this legislation to get the trust of the consumer. Especially in domains like HR, it's very important that candidates understand that AI is being used and that this AI is being used in a trustworthy, responsible manner. The third point why we need this legislation is that it avoids unfair competition. So like I mentioned, being ethical with your AI is currently an optional thing, which of course, cutting corners can give you a competitive advantage, which is not the effect we want. So this legislation really provides a level playing field, if you will. The AI Act, we hear a lot about it, and that's mainly because it is the most extensive kind of ambitious kind of legislation that we currently have. So most of the legal aspects in AI, from our perspective, goes into the AI Act. And basically, it tries to capture, like I said, it tries to capture these responsible AI principles. So that means protecting these fundamental rights, protecting health and safety, and making sure that AI is human-centric. So it focuses on supporting people instead of full automation or replacing people. In the AI Act, there are several roles defined, if you will. And each of these roles, they have different responsibilities. So for example, at Textkernel, we are the provider of AI systems. We build them and we control how we train them, and we sell it to other companies. So in this case, those companies would be the deployer of an AI system, which means that they use it, but they offer it to their employees, for example, but they don't build the system themselves. So they have less control over what is in the AI system, but still they have some important obligations when it comes to using this. Another noteworthy role in this case is the affected person, which is in our domain generally the candidates, job seekers. And they, of course, we need to keep into account their rights as well. Now, the AI Act is basically a risk-based approach. So this is at the very core of the AI Act. Basically, it classifies AI applications by a risk level, and based on this risk level, you have to either comply to very strict regulation, or there's some in limited risk scenarios, there is less strict regulation you have to follow. So if we start with the unacceptable risk, that is really like stuff that is forbidden, in any scenario. So you can think of social scoring mechanisms where AI, helps you helps government track people, and those kinds of dystopian scenarios. But directly under that is the high risk category, and this is a category where the applications are where AI actually could have a serious impact on people's lives, like HR, recruitment, staffing. So that's important to realize. According to the AI Act, what we are all doing here is considered high risk. And therefore, we have to comply to some strict regulations. So for limited risk, you can imagine like generating images or music or whatever, which of course is less prone to harm people. And there is a special category for general purpose AI, which covers the foundational models like GPT, these are kind of generic language models that don't specifically have one application, but they can be used to build applications on top of. For example, you can create an HR specific application on this general purpose AI. So there are separate rules for that. But we care mostly about this high risk category because that's where almost all HR applications will be in. Now, what does that mean? So now we need to comply to these 7 pillars, these obligations. And basically, so without going too deep into each of them, basically this means that we need to understand the risks that come with the AI system, and we need to measure if people are using it in a correct way. We need to understand how people are using it. We need to understand what data we use to train this system. And we need to make sure that the user understands that that they are using AI and what the limitations of this AI are. So it's really a diverse set of obligations that should just make sure that the entire application is checked and monitored, and that the people can use it in a responsible manner. So this is, yeah, can be quite, there can be quite high fines if you violate this act. So this is really something that companies are looking at seriously, because yeah, there might be serious consequences otherwise. All right, so let's move on to the last part of this presentation, which is about the practical implications of the AI Act. And then I'm going to hand it to Daniel.
Thanks, Vincent. So as Vincent mentioned, I'm going to kind of focus on the practical implications of the AI Act. So as Vincent mentioned previously, the key heads of terms that we ran through of the AI Act: risk management, data governance, keeping technical documentation, record keeping, transparency, all of these things are aimed at essentially protecting people from the risks of AI. And from a legal perspective, you know, some of these key risks will be data protection. So AI systems present a major risk in terms of protecting people's data. As Vincent said, they're trained on, that is how AI systems are trained, on data. There's also risk of discrimination or bias, because data used to train AI systems often contains historic human biases, and therefore it's replicated in the often replicated in the output of AI systems, and sometimes even perpetuated. And then also there are intellectual property risks, which are probably less of a serious threat to, you know, humankind, but are similarly a risk. So the AI Act speaks to all of these areas of law. So under the AI Act, organizations must clearly evidence the steps they've taken to safeguard against these risks throughout the AI system's lifecycle. And creators and users of AI systems should be able to explain, so far as possible, which is challenging, how and why a decision was reached, with supporting evidence as far as possible. And typically this hasn't been straightforward for the reason Vincent mentioned, the black box of AI systems, which means you can't just simply lift the lid up on an AI system and work out why one decision was reached over another. And in some instances, you know, commercial organizations are unwilling to disclose that information. So two examples highlight these 2 points. One is in relation to an early AI system that attempted to identify wolves. That was its one goal, and the system was pretty good at it and was achieving around 85–90% success rates in identifying wolves, but sometimes it just got it wrong, and the creators just could not work out what the issue was and why sometimes it just couldn't identify the wolves. And eventually they worked out that the system wasn't actually identifying wolves, it was identifying snow in the background. So I think that's a helpful way to kind of imagine how it's not so possible to just look at there's an input and there's an output, and there's not much information on the in-between stages and how decisions are reached. A second example is a Deliveroo case that occurred in Italy a few years ago. Essentially, a number of employees brought a claim against the company because they felt the algorithms the algorithm gave employees who accepted shifts on Fridays and Saturday nights access to the best shifts, and a group of women felt that this was indirectly discriminatory, in that they felt that women had childcare responsibilities on the Friday and Saturday night, and therefore were treated less favorably because of this policy. When it went to court, Deliveroo didn't disclose the details of the algorithm and instead accepted liability in the claims and just updated the algorithm. So for some organizations, it's more valuable to protect the details of their algorithm, which presumably costs millions of pounds to develop, rather than disclosing the workings of algorithms. So on the one hand, it's not possible sometimes, and equally, some organizations aren't willing to do it, basically. So next slide, please. So the AI Act aims to increase the explainability of AI systems. So explainability is understood to include how a company's ended up using certain data, a model, and why they're using it in certain ways, why this use of certain data or different models has related in certain outcomes, why they have followed these measures, in the hope that if you track AI's life cycle and the decision-making processes, you get a better understanding of how and why a system has reached a decision. So, for example, if a creator of an AI system had a data set and they were aware from the outset that they were unable to collect enough data from disabled employees, they could include in their risk assessment that, this is how the AI system is trained, and this is something that the creators and users can be wary of going forward when using this system. Equally, it would track right and wrong decisions throughout the AI system's life cycle, and that would go on to users of the system. So users of the system, say, for example, using a CV screening tool, may want to continually track candidates have been selected, candidates that haven't been selected, comparisons with these statistics in relation to historic equality and diversity statistics, and be able to explain how and why decisions were made as far as possible. And it's not a case of just holding your hands up and say, our AI systems are not explainable, it's a black box, so the decision's the decision. So yeah, the first two bullet points here are probably more focused at creators of AI systems, and identifying known and foreseeable risks and trying to eliminate them. Well, the top point, I mean, if there's people or humans using the AI system in practice, it doesn't mean that they can't review known and foreseeable risks, for example, bias in AI systems, and take steps to eliminate or reduce those risks. Accounting for design choices and suitability of data sets, that's probably for the creators. Maintaining quality management systems. So if you're thinking of introducing an AI system, you're wary of the risk of bias. What procedures and instructions and policies will you have around the use of this product to ensure that the risks are safeguarded against? Reviewing the performance and capabilities of the system. So again, like I've mentioned, you may want to track an AI system's performance against historic recruitment practices of the company to assess whether things have changed significantly. It could even be a case of, for the first few years of implementation, continuing to use traditional recruitment practices and compare the results between the AI system and the human recruiters. And then, we would always say, human oversight to fully understand the system's capabilities and limitations should always be considered on an ongoing basis. So, eventually the goal would be for humans to correctly interpret, how an AI system is making decisions so far as possible. But as Vincent said, with ChatGPT models, they're extremely complicated and quite opaque at this point. So getting to that stage may require some work. Next slide, please. So bias in AI systems, I guess the risk is that it leads to real world discrimination. So on the one hand, you want the AI system to be explainable as possible, and you want to comply with the AI Act to avoid incurring fines under the AI Act. But the design of the AI Act is to avoid real world discrimination. So indirect discrimination is when a working practice, policy, or rule is the same for everyone, but has a worse effect on someone because of a protected characteristic. So, for example, if a law firm had a policy that, you had to be 6 foot to get a job, that would be indirectly discriminatory against women who are smaller, and it can't be justified. In an AI context, it may be that a company uses an AI system that treats a certain group, for example, women, less favorably, and that treatment can't be justified. Direct discrimination is when someone's put at a disadvantage or treated less favorably because of a protected characteristic. So if a company had a policy that, no people with disabilities were allowed to come to a work social, then that would obviously be directly discriminatory. But why this is all relevant for AI, particularly in the case of direct discrimination, when an employee brings a claim to court, they must have a burden of proof to discharge in the first instance, and they need to prove to the court that on the balance of probabilities, they were more likely than not to have been discriminated against. So if they can prove that there was over a 50% likelihood that they were discriminated against, so for example, there were 5 roles going and they were all awarded to white straight men, and women didn't fit that category, or another group didn't fit that category, and they built a case that suggested they had been discriminated against, the burden of proof will then shift to the employer to show that there's an over 50% chance that they haven't discriminated against this individual. And if a company is using an AI system to make these decisions, and they have no understanding of how the AI system has worked, and there's no human safeguards in place, there's no review systems, no ongoing review of statistics, the likelihood is an employer will be unable to discharge that burden of proof and show that on the balance of probabilities they haven't discriminated. So the element of explainability would be crucial for any company using an AI system attempting to defend a claim of discrimination. So all of the safeguards under the AI Act speak to current employment law also in terms of avoiding discrimination. Next slide, please. So what can employers do? The Institute of Future for Work identifies a number of recommendations. So probably the main point, using algorithms to advise and work alongside human managers, not replace them. A human manager should always have final responsibility on decisions. So if you're implementing an AI system, it may be that you bring in the AI system, assess its performance. Maybe the workforce can adapt around the AI system. It may be that people are more in charge of comparing results between the AI system and historic results, or tracking diversity in the business amongst protected characteristics, and ultimately, it could lead to efficiencies where less workers are required, or workers are required to do different jobs around the AI system. But humans should always have final decision. Line manager training on how to understand algorithms. So like I say, it could be, there's going to be increased data on if there are 1,000 CVs reviewed and 20 are recommended, how are you going to review not only those who have been recommended, but those who have been rejected? keeping track of hiring practices against historic hiring practices, keeping track of how hiring practices are developing and in what direction things are going. Are the results positive or negative? So there's going to be more data involved in using AI systems. Transparency. So obviously in terms of direct discrimination, a company will have to provide reasoning as to how it's reached a decision, but also in day-to-day employment, if you're awarding using an AI system to avoid shifts, for example, a company should be able to explain how the system works, what data it uses, why it's reached one output over another. It will probably affect negatively employee relations if it's a case of employers simply saying, we don't know how it's reached a decision, but this decision, you need to deal with it. People will want explanations. There should be appropriate documentary evidence in place, so privacy notices, notifying employees how their data will be used, and notifying employees that AI systems may be used for making decisions. And again, as I've mentioned, continued reporting on equality and diversity. It is a feature of humans that we have biases, and those are reflected in AI systems inevitably because AI systems are trained on human data. So with that in mind, it's obviously worth keeping in mind that there is a risk in terms of biased decision making. Obviously, creators of these systems try to debug as far as possible, but of course, there's nothing wrong with staying on top of those issues as far as possible. Next slide, please. And so just looking forward, there are persuasive arguments for making greater use of algorithms in all areas of employment and recruitment. And if used properly, they're likely to lead to better matches between tasks and the attributes of people, just because they don't have favoritism, they don't have any of those kind of human attributes like that. It would just be, data which would ideally be more effective in reaching some decisions. Ideally, we'll reach a point where it's possible to strike a balance between the optimization of algorithms and the transparency concerns that people have around using them. And with the AI Act, things should become more explainable now that there is a positive obligation on creators and users to increase the explainability. Thanks, Vincent. So here is a QR code.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Saying thank you everyone for listening to this webinar, and thank you, Daniel, for joining me. If you have any questions, feel free to put them on the chat. Otherwise, also if questions pop up later, then feel free to connect to us, and yeah, we can definitely continue the discussion. And thanks to APSCo for facilitating this webinar.
All right, it's our pleasure. Thanks ever so much, Daniel, and to Vincent. And I think Rosie asked about the slides, which we will share with them. And there should be another QR code that's popping up for the attendees to complete, which is just about the feedback from the meeting today. But yeah, thanks so much, Daniel and Vincent, for your time.
Yeah, happy to do this.
No problem.
And some insightful and a little alarming, some of the information, I think, Daniel, but I think you're right with regards to obviously the legislation. I think that it's how it's governed and obviously how it'll affect everybody. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, and thanks everybody for attending. If you can, as I say, complete the feedback, that'd be really valuable to us, so it shapes and obviously positions what we offer to you going forward. But thanks a lot for your time, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much.